So today we are talking design. Um, so last time we talked about concepts that definitely overlap with design. So skateboarding, and then our 10x rule of dev. And I'm sorry, can you guys hear that in the background? There's like construction. I can move over if this is bothering
Yeah, a bit.
a bit. Let me.
Yeah.
All good. This is a sunnier spot anyway. Okay. And we also went through this intersection of dollars, code, pixels, how the three are working together. Um, we also went through kind of the x-ray of what software is and where design starts, stops, and hands it over to dev. I would specifically say those like first three screens are where the design world in some way, shape, or form overlaps. Um, anyway, we're here to talk about just the design part. We'll get into the budgeting, dev parts in later sessions. So what is design? Has anybody heard of Kanye West? I'm joking. We're not going to go there. But design is a pretty open-ended question. For our company, for Turtle, I'm the person that spends the most time on design, so we're the closest thing that we have to a designer. Yet when I work with certain designers, I feel embarrassed to call myself a designer. Um, some people call that imposter syndrome. Some people call that a lack of professional design training. I don't know how you want to call it, but in any way, shape, or form, I think design is what you make it. Design is what the skills you come to the table with, but design is being able to take something that's intangible and create it into something tangible for others on the team to work with. More specifically, in today's world, it's some combination of these tools, and specifically in the world of software dev and creating products. These are some of the tools that you may have heard of. In the bottom corner here, we have Balsamiq, Keynote, and even Google Sheets. So tools often used for wireframing, putting together a prototype. They're not going to get you a kind of development ready to design, but these tools will. So Sketch, Figma, Framer, Adobe Photoshop, and XD. My design journey started with Photoshop, and then I moved over to Sketch for many years, and it was really good to me. And then just recently, I've moved over to Figma. And then you may have seen some of these tools like InVision and Abstract, Zeppelin and Avocode. InVision is really to be able to stitch together designs and show a prototype before you have something built. Abstract is it's more of a design system tool, so for larger design teams, almost like a GitHub for design. And then Zeppelin and Avocode both let you take Adobe XD or just about any kind of files and present them in a way that a developer doesn't have to install the original design software and kind of look at the x-ray of a design without having to actually run the same design software, which just helps the team operate more quickly. So here's an example of quite literally a design that you might see in software development. For people that have used Turtle's mobile app, you might have actually seen these designs in a live product. But this is what a design may look like. It's communicating a flow, a process, a task, something that you want that doesn't exist yet in a product. In this case, it's pretty simple. It's a mobile chat system with being able to add a task, where there are the raw design files, there are descriptions of these files, there's some notes that I'm including to kind of communicate over to developers that are working on this, what I may be thinking, what I'm not thinking. But either way, I just wanted to give you an example of, what a non-professional designers or non-professionally trained designer, but somebody who is making these development ready designs in a team, what they might produce. I've included a link to the full design file here if you want to look at it after this session, just be able to click around. I don't do this perfectly and follow the rules and use component libraries and all these things that a trained designer would do. But I think it's important to see that so that you don't get stuck in building design systems and kind of learning the mechanics before actually being able to apply it to yourself. There obviously has to be a balance of how much you learn the mechanics of these different tools and how much you actually spend on applying them. So in today's world, I would really focus on either Figma or Sketch at this point. What I really like about Figma and what they've really changed in the design ecosystem is everything is a link. So every design file from beginning to finish, if it's a wireframe, if it's a full-on dev-ready design, it starts as a link, ends as a link. So even if someone doesn't have Figma installed, if you're sharing with a developer or another designer for review or anybody else, you're sending them a link. If you use Sketch for something like that, but they do have Sketch Cloud coming out now, which is a competitor, you would have to use something like Zeppelin to take a file from Sketch, put it into Zeppelin eventually, and then share that link. Does that make sense from kind of the shareability perspective of it? Cool. And if you think about team cycles and velocity, et cetera, that starts becoming even more important. That said, you should use whatever you're most comfortable with, whatever you're going to learn quickest. As I said earlier, design doesn't have like a formal definition, or at least not in my book. So I think a designer is as good as what a team can come up with or train or afford at a certain time in a company's journey. And it's important to step back and use what's going to produce the best results for the team or the individual that's actually working here. Okay. This is a design. This is a Google sheet that somebody at Turtle actually made to mock up what actual versus committed hours on projects look like. And they just used Google Sheets. They didn't use Figma. They didn't use Sketch. They didn't use anything. They wanted to communicate an idea and get it over to someone so that we can start prototyping. This is a design, though. This is not, it shouldn't be laughed at, and people should be using the skills that they come to the table with, whether they're visual or they've spent their entire careers in spreadsheets, or if they're great writers. There's a lot of different ways to communicate intangible into tangible on a team. This is actually a design. This is a pretty clear communication using existing products of what somebody wishes would exist in the world. I'm not sure if any of you follow Jessie Jessie Frizella on Twitter. I mean, she's a character, but this is a pretty clear description of what a product could be. And this is obviously an exaggeration. If you're actually delivering product specs to someone or descriptions of what's to be built to someone, you'd want to go longer than the length of a tweet. But you can use text. And then there's the other extreme. There's an actual design that looks like a fully functioning product that'll show you the animations, the slides in between. So, you really can take either extremes here. This design is actually made by our guest speaker who will be joining us later. So just to give you an example of what a professional designer might come up with. From a tool set perspective, what Alex used to create this is probably a combination of Sketch and Figma, Sketch or Figma, and then Principle, which kind of lets him put all these animations together and into a GIF, maybe even some other tool to kind of put it in this layout to present on a phone. Second. But the most important thing that you want to do, no matter how you're designing, is communicate priority. Whether you're a trained designer, an untrained designer, a visual designer, a text designer, anyone can communicate priority, and there's a few simple rules to follow here. There's color. So, and when I say color, I actually mean gray, like white to gray. I wouldn't even in the initial stages confuse designs with color and bring all that in unless you really know how color is being used and what it's communicating. I would keep things to black and white or everything in between to communicate priority. So looking at color first, light gray, not important, all the way to black looking most important, especially relative to each other if we just focus on this section. Weight or thickness, going from light to heavy, again, communicating priority there. Or size, not important to most important from smallest to biggest. This stuff might sound obvious, but when you're actually wireframing or designing a product, remembering some of these rules, how they fit together, becomes critical, especially if you're communicating priority to someone else that you're working with. I put a link in this as well that you can review after, Henry Marte's No BS Guide to Wireframing, but I really like the article. I really like how he kind of puts together some of these layouts and shows examples of them and how they can all work together between placement and color and darkness, etc. So I would definitely check that out after this session if you want to go a little further into wireframing specifics. I also wanted to give you an idea of what a professional designer might create as a wireframe. So we're building a desktop version of chat that feels and looks a lot like Slack and simplifies some of the Turtle process. And in a couple of sessions, this is what a designer that we were working with and I came up with. So very similar to what you might see an untrained designer like myself come up with, but things are obviously going to be more balanced. Everything will look consistent. If you open the actual design files, things are probably going to be organized a lot more, but I want you to look at this for two reasons. One, to see an example of what a professional might do for wireframing, but two, to also remind yourself that you could do something close to this too, no matter how trained you really are. Just remember the principles of how to communicate priority, using blacks and whites and no colors unless you really know how to use them in design. And don't be afraid to use notes too. A lot of people can't communicate everything with just a visual. So, the time that I would say to bring in another color is when you obviously don't want it included in the design. I'm not going to scroll back kind of the 12 slides up, but if you saw I had like some red text that obviously wasn't part of the design, I'll usually use a color that very clearly should not be part of the actual implementation, so that it's clear that it's just a note or comment without having to kind of over design or use like default like yellow notes or anything like that. So then beyond the visual static design of a wireframe or individual production level design, it's important to remember that you are communicating to somebody else that you'll be working with, whether that's a designer or whether that's a developer. And one of the easiest ways to communicate is follow a storyline. So quite literally, there's a beginning, middle, and end in every story. In a design, I would put that as context, action, and outcome. So context being the starting point. So where are you in a product? Who's using the product? What are they actually doing? And then what is the outcome that should be received from that? In a design that we've been working on recently, so this does not exist yet, but this is a concept for internal chat to be able to create a task inside of a chat. But it follows the same context, action, outcome structure. So the context is there's a user, and I try to be as specific as possible. So I try to use real names. I try to use people that are actually using Turtle. So it's my co-founder, Venkat, notices a bug. He starts typing hashtag and hits create new from this contextual menu that's shown here. So our context is actually starting with hitting create new. Everything before that we pretend or imagine already exists. We're just focused on this starting context. Now the action is actually typing in a new task that doesn't exist yet. And then the outcome on the right side is that the task is created, but Venkat is then taken back to the task where he actually created it from, not this new task. So there's some nuances to pick up there, in that this task is actually only referenced inside of this little message, and this original task is actually the same as where he started typing from. But it's an example of showing this is where you started, this is your action, and this is your end, or context, action, outcome. And in this context, action, outcome, if we think about it from this 10x rule of software dev, at each stage of software dev, we're handing things off to someone else. So if we're a professional designer, we're probably going to design as far as we can and hand things off to code. And if we're a professional writer, we might write an idea or wireframe an idea before we actually hand it off to design. But at any of those stages, we're working in these cycles of context, action, outcome. And if we put them in this team dimension, it's really, we've got input, and then a team or an individual works on it, and then you get an outcome, and then you get an enhanced input. So that enhanced input could be what you work on next, what you budget for next, or a new product being released and more information that you now have to make the next decisions, which starts overlapping a lot with what we talked about in last session with getting to the next horizon, so that you have enough information possible to make the next decision, or our concepts of skateboarding. So if we think about things in the dimension of skateboarding, where really a company is as many cycles as you can get on either testing a product or using a product or getting a product out to market, or however far you're able to get it. If you think about things in these cycles, then that same input team outcome, or input individual outcome, or input action outcome become these cycles of let's get things as far as we can, or as far as we can afford at this time, or as much as we can do at this time, so that we can take another cycle, so that we can take another cycle. So there's, if you really zoom out and look at things, in a few different ways here. There's a lot of overlap between some of the very specifics for what how you should be approaching an individual design, and how this fits into the larger infrastructure of how a team might work on it, how a developer might work on it, and even in how you might budget a project like this. So we'll get into that in later sessions some more, but I wanted to make sure to show some of that overlap. I would really keep your focus on, is that outcome, is that final stage as clear as it can be? And I understand that's a pretty general statement, but that's a general statement because everybody comes to the table with very different skills when it comes to being a designer. Unless you're a trained designer that's been making apps or websites for a long time, it really depends on what natural skills you come to the table with, what trained skills you come to the table with, how quickly you can learn, how much time you have to learn. It becomes a serious balancing game. So I would look at it as more like, is the outcome as clear as it can be, or as clear as is worth it? So if you're going to spend the next 6 months trying to internally design something that you really could have outsourced and had somebody else do, or worked with a professional designer, or worked with a friend, or something in between, or hired someone, there's definitely a point at which it's not worth it to kind of keep cycling yourself before involving others. And kind of to simplify some of these definitions, because I know we bounced around with the definitions of input, team outcome, and input action outcome. Your outcome is that you want something to be development ready. You want to be as clear as possible in, here's what we're building, why this is the desired outcome, this is what we're testing against, and that usually comes in the form of a design, a visual, a write-up, or something that can very clearly communicate to everyone, this is what dev ready means. And a good test for that is, if you asked multiple people looking at the same thing, would they give you the same definition of what dev ready means? And that's a pretty easy test to have. So quite literally, you can ask your team or an individual that you're working with, and make sure that that definition is the same as what's in your head. Now, when you're working with others, here are basically the 3 categories to think about. There's do it yourself, which means learn to get designs to dev ready. There's hire, which is you pay a salary for an actual designer to get something to dev ready, or you outsource, which is a pretty general category of paying an hourly or project fee to get designs to dev ready. The cost for do it yourself is pretty low. You might take some training, or, I mean, I guess it could get high if you go to art school, but there's definitely a huge time component to be aware of. Now, the trade-offs are, at this stage with Turtle, I have taken over the majority of our design, even though in the early stages, we did have a lead designer that was working with us. And one of the biggest reasons we did that was for control. We're in a phase right now where we're not really building new features. We're kind of fine-tuning existing features and making them as good as they can get. And instead of it add 5 features a quarter, we're trying to make chat as fast as possible. So we're really focusing in on just a few core features that matter to us most. So because of this, there's a lot of nuance that goes into the specifics of just chat. And I want to be able to focus on that without kind of another piece to the engine. So for me, there's a benefit to more control. This isn't reasonable for everyone. So if you don't have some kind of design background, if you haven't been doing this for a while, it might not be a viable option, but I would certainly entertain it. And if you can pretty quickly pick up design and start making something that's pretty clear, I wouldn't shy away from learning as much as you can there. And everyone can learn to wireframe, or at minimum, write up requirements, write up specs, and communicate priority with text only. Now you can hire, so paying a salary to someone that's full-time. It depends on your geography. I know a few of you are out of the US. For those of you that are in the US, if you're competing with Silicon Valley or New York, this is incredibly difficult. We'll hear from a Silicon Valley-based designer soon, and I don't think we should go into specifics of salary and all that, but you can Google all that stuff and see what kind of numbers you would have to afford to be able to compete with those companies, and they're pretty high. That said, if you're hiring out of the country, or if you're based out of the country, those numbers are obviously relative to different geographies. So that's not a blanket rule for everyone. But if you're hiring in New York or in San Francisco, unfortunately, the price threshold is pretty high. There's definitely a time component to it too, in both hiring and nurturing someone. If you find the best designer in the world and can pay them as much as what Google and Facebook are paying them, but you can't actually motivate and manage them and work with them as a team, you're not going to get your money's worth. You're not going to get your time's worth. It just wouldn't work out. So as with anything, it's you get what you pay for and you get what you put in. Now, outsourcing becomes a pretty wide array of options. Outsourcing is everything from finding someone on Fiverr or on Upwork and putting together a very small project, to finding consistent freelancers, to using something like TopTal for slightly higher end freelancers, to being able to use an agency or a design shop. It's really having an outsider do the work on either an hourly or a project fee. So I didn't put a specific dollar or time amount because this is a very wide range of things. And if you'd like to go a little deeper into it, I think we could do that in open land. But there are a ton of options in this outsourcing field. There's a lot of ways to do it right. There's a lot of ways to do it wrong. I've written about it before. I'm borderline obsessed with the topic, given that I have a business in this area. So I'm happy to talk further with everyone about this, especially in open land or in later sessions, but I want to make sure we don't suck the whole session away at outsourcing. That said, at this point, you're probably thinking, you're like, well, if I'm not a designer and I don't have all this crazy amounts of money, like, what do I do? And am I screwed? And can I just not design? That's not necessarily the case. There is like a sort of a cheat code. It's not quite a unicorn. It's not that bad either. It's somewhere in between. And I want to be really careful with calling this a silver bullet because it isn't one. There are no silver bullets, but it is a nice way to work without a designer in the early stages of product development, especially if you can really learn this and understand what it is and what it isn't. UI frameworks and UI kits. So this basically gives you a cheat code to cover everything on the left side of this equation. A UI kit looks something like, whoops, sorry, that hit my link. There we go. Sorry, I think I skipped that slide. This would be an example of a couple UI kits. This one is called, it's Bootstrap by CSS, and I think this is showing a paid version of one of their kits. They have a free version as well. But essentially, you can look at any of these components and get pre-built design and code. There are obviously some limits on the customization of what you can do. Some of these kits you can take and then custom design later, but I would again nuance that because customizing one of these designs might not be as clear or as smooth or as elegant as simply designing something on your own. I would use this in the early stages of when you're prototyping something or for something like an admin screen. In all of Turtle's admin dashboards, we use UI kits just because we don't want to spend the cycles of wireframing and design and everything in between just to get an admin dashboard that nobody's really seeing together. I put a list of a bunch of these out there. So React Material UI for web, Bootstrap, and then React Bootstrap, Semantic, some iOS kits, some Android kits. So you can use this for web and for mobile development. It's basically pre-built design and code. So somebody has thought about the wireframe, the actual design, the actual front-end code and implementation, but you're using something that somebody else thought of that might not be a perfect solution for whatever problem you're solving. So it can definitely get you somewhere. It can get you a leg up and can let you skip a lot of the steps, but it is not a custom design. Facebook or Twitter or any of those systems were not built by someone else's UI kits. They were built by designing a very specific solution to a very specific problem. But if you find yourself in an early stage product development situation where you aren't a designer or don't have the funds yet to afford one, these are absolutely great resources to look at. But use with caution, do your own research, talk with your team, think about the implementation, what the strategy is for long-term use. I know companies that use Semantic UI for into the millions of dollars of development, and they've really heavily customized Semantic UI beyond its basic configurations. There are companies that spend their first few $1,000s to build something in Material, and then a Material UI React, and then might rebuild that in custom design and custom code. So please don't look at these as a complete cheat code. They're just really meant for the early stages or for stuff that doesn't require design. But you should be aware of them so that you don't look at every little piece of product dev as this cycle of design, develop, etc. I also put some general design resources for you to look at. So Dribble is a great place where people just constantly, designers constantly share their designs. So it's a great place to find what you like, styles you like, designers you like, uh, designers to follow and see their processes. You can also find them on Instagram and Twitter and all that, and they'll constantly push a lot of their process out that you can follow. I referenced that No BS Guide to Wireframing before. A bunch of examples of wireframes. I think anyone can get good at this part of it, the wireframing stage. The design stage gets a little trickier, but if you'd like to see how much the stuff makes sense to you and to get into some of the details of Figma specifically, Meng To's Design Systems in Figma course, it's a write-up, it's free, it's really nice, and it'll kind of get you the ins and outs of what something like Figma and the specific design systems might look like. And then I wanted to point out free illustrations from Undraw. This is a super cool free resource, just and as you're designing, as you're communicating stuff, these are all royalty free and made by a wonderful designer out of Greece. She's been gracious enough to just release these with no license. So I'd highly recommend using these in designs and visual communications. I use them all the time. I think I even use them in that 10x screen. All right, oops. So I think we may have had Alex just join in. Alex, are you here?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Hey, we can hear you. So Alex, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to give a quick intro of what I know of Alex, and then we're gonna let him take over, and we're gonna ask some questions. So first of all, here's a screenshot from his site, and here's how Alex described himself. So he's a senior product designer in the Bay Area. This is quite an understatement. So I've had the pleasure of working with Alex for the better part of a decade, and being close friends with him. And he helped start my first business, Darwin Apps. And he is someone that next to him, I cannot call myself a designer. He's someone that can take a concept and very quickly go through all three of those first phases of idea to wireframing to design, and take something that might be complicated and might take someone 10 screens or 10 different visuals and condense it down to one really simple visual that really communicates priority, purpose, in something that also feels really simple, elegant, easy to use. He helped start Darwin Apps with me, as I mentioned. He spent a lot of his career at Google, and now he's at LinkedIn. I pulled out a few of my favorite designs that he's made. This one, it was from 2013. He remade the BMW start-stop button entirely in Photoshop. So this is using 0 photos. This is just using Photoshop layers from nothing. Then I can't make something like this. I don't understand lighting and patterns and all that like this. So I just to give you an idea of what some designers can make. I think this kind of stuff is incredible, and it's just fun to look at too. Here's something that he made for Google, specifically wait times and availability. If anybody's seen those like purple bars and blue bars in availability, this is a project that Alex had worked on. And just for fun, I included one more because these are super fun to look at. I think this was like reconceptualizing Airbnb and its animations and designs. All right, that was fun. I want to make sure we don't get too stuck on my slides here, and we get a chance for Alex to talk and for you to all ask him questions as well. So I'm going to stop my screen share. And Alex,
yeah.
So if you can you give us just a few minute overview of your design career? What is it that you do at LinkedIn, and maybe a bit about what you did at Google as well?
Yeah, not necessarily sure where to start. Kind of like Vlad said, I've been kind of doing this for many moons. I don't know, it's been over like give or take like relatively 15 years. Kind of getting started earlier in like the kind of my school phase, when things were a little bit hazy in the design sector. Kind of got started in animation and motion. So I did a lot of Flash work back in the day, and I was more of a kind of an underlying like illustrator. I did a lot of screen printing, lithography, stuff like that. More of like the studio space. That was it was more hands-on. And then I kind of bled into like the screen world, as I call it. It wasn't really like, everything wasn't really kind of like, bent on devices and scaling for viewports and all those things. It was like some cross-browser support, and then letting those things evolve into things that were more scalable. So it was just like interesting. So I did that for a while. I kind of moved into the social gaming space. So I did a lot of stuff for agencies that worked on like kind of like social apps that were either like monetized or just trying to drive general engagement for brands and smaller like companies. So I work with like Converse and Sapient and stuff like that. And then I kind of moved into the e-com space, worked on a number of other like more like e-tailer side of things, such as like for Zippo and Journeys and Liz Lange maternity and stuff like that. That kind of like ran its course. It was very templatized. Everyone kind of wanted the same thing. So it was a really interesting like learning experience, but it wasn't that innovative. And so I ended up joining Vlad and a few others. We moved to the Bay a couple of years ago, and that's an understatement. It's like
2012.
7 or so, somewhat
Yeah.
years ago. And so then we started Darwin, and we worked with a lot of other like early stage companies and folks that were just trying to get started on things. But we also got to work with some other like higher tiered companies like AT&T and Creative Dash and stuff like that. So we did some really interesting like experimental work. We weren't really sure where it was going to go, but it was cool, and it was an opportunity to like try something that not everyone was. And it was also kind of an interesting space because back then it wasn't quite as saturated, I would say, as it is today. So I think like evolving over time and seeing how things have picked up or escalated or moved at like an accelerated pace has been it's been cool but challenging at the same time. So staying on your toes and staying like aware of things as they move is pretty important. Like the moment you like take a long vacation and you don't check like your phone, like something has changed dramatically. So I think like always being aware of your surroundings and things that are trending and stuff like that, and stay like inspirational is also key. So anyway, so I did that, and then I moved into the Google space for a while. I worked on the merchant side, and I also worked on the consumer side. So everything from like how you manage a business to essentially how a business communicates with all of its consumers. So everything you see on Maps, which runs through what's called a local intent, was part of my team. So everything from looking for toilet paper around you to a restaurant in India, or a hospital or a DMV or an urgent care center. Those were the things that we touched. So we worked in the local space, kind of adding and evolving the framework and features across that framework. So just various initiatives that were owned by different designers, and we work with a lot of people, a lot of time zones. This team in particular actually stretched between Zurich, London, Tokyo, Sydney, San Francisco, and New York. And so each one owned different things, and we kind of had to collaborate at this like kind of insane level. So it was great, a lot of cool people. Things maybe took a little longer than they should because of that. But I think at the end of the day, you had something kind of rewarding and impactful that a lot of people around the world had access to for free, typically. So, did that. And then I kind of explored some other things. And then I kind of came back to this space. Now I'm kind of helping out LinkedIn go through a couple different larger initiatives. And so that's kind of what I've been working on. In that space, it's been a lot around system design and like infrastructure and sharing and home and the feed itself. And so that's across like feed relevance and content experience. And so it stretches a lot of different things. So that's kind of what I've been doing career-wise, but I always remain like interested in development and like strategy and like working with many other people. I don't like to be too siloed. It's nice at times, but it's good to stand your toes alongside others. Otherwise you get a little bit like, bound to one thing or one lens. So I've just been kind of keep that lens open, and then, just kind of like learn from others as well along the way.
So there's a lot to unpack there. Thanks for that intro. I think to summarize a few of those points, when Alex was mentioning viewports, does everybody know what a viewport is? If not, viewports are basically different screen sizes. So if something is being viewed on mobile or something being viewed on desktop, and I think it's important to pick out that Alex started off doing screen printing and physical design, and then moving that over to viewports. But if you talk to a designer who was an artist first, you'll notice that a lot, where there's overlap between what they've worked on with physical design or art canvases or a mobile viewport, they kind of think about it as the same and solving the same problem, just with different tools and with different constraints. Alex also talked about, you know, keeping things interesting and not wanting to be siloed. And I think that's really important to pick up for, you know, anybody in this room aspires to build a company to be able to work with a designer like Alex, myself included. You know, it's not easy. There's the simple stuff like the financial stuff and affording someone like Alex, but there's also the motivation side, which I think is incredibly important to pick up on. And then Alex constantly mentioned these ever evolving tools and processes and all that, and really staying on your toes. And I think I can't reiterate that enough. Stuff just changes in this design world, and don't get stuck. You know, stick with the fundamentals and the general rules. Don't subscribe to anyone's one Bible of how you do things. Things are going to change constantly. So, Alex, I have one question I wanted to cover, generally speaking, before we hand it over to others to start asking you stuff. This came up in our session earlier before you joined, and it came up in some of the chats that we've had in the group. How do you go about communicating priority? And specifically, not only how do you go about it, but you know, what are some of your favorite ways to have priority communicated to you? You know, we talked about using grays and blacks and thickness and size of elements and positioning of elements to communicate priority. But when someone is working with a designer in the context of a startup, they're probably going to deliver a wireframe or a text description of something, or maybe a rough design of something. And they're going to communicate their priority of a product, what's most important, what's least important. And then you're going to take those designs and turn them into something that probably much more clearly communicates priority, importance, et cetera. So how do you approach it from your designs? And then how do you like seeing it approached from what's delivered to you?
Sure. I don't, I would say like some of this can sometimes be subjective. Like sometimes people will try to use like expertise to gauge or judge a layout or a structure or an argument of like why something should look the way it looks or works the way that it works. I think a key component before you do anything like that, or before you start, pen to paper kind of thing, is like some data. It's very hard to frivolously go into a project or a design without some background. It'll not be in your best interest to go blindly into that night. So having like, regardless if you're working like kind of alone or whatever the circumstance is, having like a good like PM, data scientist kind of thought partner, researcher, is kind of like essential. You don't really always have that luxury necessarily, depending on where you are or what you're working on. But
what would you suggest for the earlier stage founders? Because just about everyone here is going to be a pretty early stage product. Either they have an early stage version or they might be pre-launch. Yep. For a team that, in the extreme case, it's a single founder. How would you approach that extreme?
Yeah, so it depends on what you're comfortable with, number one. Not a lot of folks are comfortable with like digging deep, let's say into like psychology or color theory or anything like that. But doing a little bit of homework or background on your own in that sense, I think would help start to like form an opinion. And doing a little bit of like actual background on competitive products, analysis and stuff like that you can easily do on your own will get you to a much stronger perspective than not doing that. And so without having like a lot of help or having like a team of researchers or scientists or whatever it is that you might want, you can do this by yourself. So I think like studying like trends and things that are being used and kind of like within the ether of the project that you're working on is a good place to start. It's very hard to create like a cohesive design language if you're not really sure like why you're designing that thing. So, doing some due diligence on like the homework and the scope of the project itself and figuring out what your guardrails are is a nice stepping stone to getting to something that is like what I would consider a North Star design. And so a lot of folks will kind of start with what's called like a min viable approach. You can do that from strategy, you can do that from engineering, you can do that from design. So it's what's the least that you need to get your point across. Sometimes design struggles because in that step, because it's mostly about functionality, and form will follow the function. So at some point, design will take a front seat. But I think like having all your thought partners together up front, and figuring out dependencies helps you figure out a priority, and how to structure what you want to do. You know, when you're working on wireframes, you're working on like flows, or like a user journey. I think those are just components that help lead to something cohesive. So yeah, just doing some homework on your own, trying to figure out what pain points you're solving for, and keeping it simple. And then at the same time, figuring out how can you step into your ideal scenario? There's almost never going to be a chance or an opportunity where you go from 0 to 100 instantaneously. You're gonna, you should break in the car. And so going from 0 to 10 to 20 to 30, I think is something that most people don't really think about. They just want to go all in. So understanding like wearing a PM styled hat, and trying to, something that I do frequently before I even get involved with like a product manager is I do what's called a product requirement doc, but from a UX perspective. A lot of the time, PMs will come to the table or come to a project with what they call a product requirement doc, which lays out technical constraints, dependencies, teams, partners that are involved, timelines, and stuff like that. And so it helps narrow down the scope of what the designer needs to think about. And so from there, you kind of just work together to come up with like a story. And I think before you go down too much of a rabbit hole in doing like high fidelity, pixel perfect work, you've got to align on a strategy. You've got to align on what the overall goals are for the user, which help you prioritize how you should go about the project.
Cool. Awesome. Well, I've got a bunch of questions for you if there's any quiet moments in the audience, but I want to make sure that the other founders all get a chance to ask you questions too. For anyone with questions, I guess to make this most cohesive, if you could just say, I've got a question in chat, and then we'll unmute you and have you go. And if you could please just say your name, your company, and then go ahead and fire off with your question. So if anybody, okay, we've got Heike with one ready to go. I'll make sure that you're unmuted. All right. Heike, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi everyone. I'm Heike, and I wanted to follow up with like a slight variation of your previous question. When working with a really good designer, would it make more sense to give them a PRD, to give them initial wireframes, or give them a Figma draft that sort of looks like the product, but it just looks bad, and then tell the designer to make it pretty?
Is that for me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's definitely, especially in today's world, there's a lot of ways to skin the cat. I don't really care for that phrase, but you understand. And so I think that there's definitely opportunities to try different things, but there is kind of like a methodology or a standardized process, like, especially when you start to introduce new software, such as Figma, there can be some friction. Not everybody is fully versed in all these things. So sometimes a very simple like product requirement doc is a great place and a playground for you and your PM to collide and argue and align and stuff like that. It's a safe space to kind of be on the same page. Sometimes I think that if you aren't given some guardrails from that perspective, it can be quite hard to know how to dial it back and to find out and to align with your own self, like how far do I go? What's feasible? What's like too much? So I think handing off, like, let's say a sketch file that is maybe not ideal, in my opinion, is a part of the process. I wouldn't make it the process. I think that you need some technical definition, so that someone who has some expertise in design can go through that and kind of shape it as they understand it. Not so much just like the other way around. And I think that like if you hand off a file that file in itself is going to need explanation. So a lot of the times, like what I'll ask PMs to do is, we have something called like napkin sketches, that can be used in different ways, but like anything is better than nothing. Trying to understand what is going on inside of someone else's mind or a group of people's mind is very hard. Like we're just designers, we're, modern day scribes, we're here trying to communicate like something visually that apparently like over 1 million people need to agree with. It's not just your closed group of your team. It's larger than that. They're just the ones that help act as a surge protector. So I think like working earlier on is super key. Being kind of dirty is super key. And then if something is just not clear and that person wants to convey a message or a flow or something that seems like it's not being conveyed through text, then you can introduce flows or wireframes or low fidelity work. And then that's when the designer kind of goes and makes it pretty.
Cool.
Okay, thank you for that. That was very, very convenient.
Yeah, for sure.
Thanks for the question, Heikki. All right, we've got a second question from Nick. Let me make sure that you're unmuted. Yeah, Nick, you're all set.
Hey, thanks for chatting with us. I'm Nick. I'm one of the co-creators of Earlystage. So Earlystage lets you listen to any digital text like websites, emails, articles, PDFs on your phone or laptop. And what I'm curious about is that you've worked with all sorts of different things. Mm-hmm. And so design-wise, what's something that's process-related that you've changed your mind about recently?
Recently? Kind of like to the point from before, is that like as things evolve, you try to fit them into your workflow. I think workflow and process are kind of interchangeable words and can also be slightly subjective depending on what the team is comfortable with. Some people kind of like doing more like sprint style work and brainstorming before they get into the nitty gritty, or kind of like get to that at a later stage. I've kind of like tried to, like a chameleon. I don't know. I mean, chameleons are cool and they don't do much, but what they do is adapt. And so like, I think you can kind of come to the table with a couple different ways to go about things, but I wouldn't make that the way that you go about things. A lot of people want to skip steps or whatever, which is okay. You don't necessarily always need like science to get you to like, why do I use this drop-down menu? But I think that there's a level of like, concept to completion that's always kind of traditional. Like you're kind of going to always drive a car like the exact same way, but maybe you drive it a little bit differently. And so I think that there's an opportunity to like always like try new things. You might work with someone who's only used to one thing. That doesn't mean that there's no opportunity to let them know that there's another way of going about this. And so I'm constantly trying to evolve that. And then like be a little bit more adaptable so that, for example, if there is no researcher or a researcher is hard to resource, what do? How do you take on that hat? Well, you basically conduct your own surveys and do your own intercept studies or try and like be a little bit more hands-on rather than not have it at all. And so what I have found is that regardless of like where you are, like let's say Google, where everybody is kind of, in your face about something, and everybody has like higher tiered expertise in that one thing, it can be kind of hard because you're like, well, why would my like bare bones approach even do anything versus this quant researcher that has had 10 years experience analyzing things? Well, what I have found is that, again, something is better than nothing. And if it's just simply not your expertise, don't worry. Like you doing very baseline research and foundational research is like much better than not doing it at all or not having a complete understanding of everything that's involved. Like you'll be surprised what you learn by doing the bare minimum. So anyways, that's kind of what
in the early stages, talking to your customers is research. Taking yourself through the process of you're a would-be customer, that is research. When you don't have a research team or access to 10,000 people to pull, sometimes that just gets in the way more than anything. And sometimes it's better to actually just ask a person one-on-one. I think a lot of times people get stuck in like, hey, let me do a Google survey for everything. And then you kind of have these disconnected reviews and survey results for people without really much context in the question that you're asking. So research done wrong can actually take you down the wrong path, especially at the early stages. But once you're in positions like at LinkedIn or at Google and are working with these world-class research teams, it's a massive advantage to figuring out what to build, what not to build. So let's see, we've got time for one more question, and it sounds like Stephanie has one. Stephanie, you want to jump in?
I don't see Stephanie in the video chat.
Yeah, there's a second section of the list if you scroll.
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can.
Hey, Alex. You guys actually just touched on what I was going to ask, which is, so first of all, I'm the co-founder of Bonmo. We're building a platform that connects brands and agencies with professional comedians for more engaging marketing content that breaks through noise. And so I wanted to get some of your thoughts on the best practices, as a founder that's doing the wireframing up to when, a founder starts working with a designer. Like, at what stage do you start collecting user feedback to kind of guide you in like the user experience? And I, like you said, there's such a thing as too early, but at what point is it too late, where you've built a lot of things out and then you realized you were going in the wrong direction? And what kind of tools are best for that? I know some people will sit down with potential users and walk through the platform with them to, ask, observe them as they're using the app or platform to see where the information gaps are. Some people will send a survey, and then some people will use like heat maps to observe, what the customer journey is. So do you have any like thoughts on that for best practices?
Yeah. I mean, again, there's a lot of kind of ways to go about these things. And I think like sometimes the challenge is like, not everyone has the opportunity to get each step in at the right time. Doesn't mean that you aren't thinking about it. It's just like, you don't have the resourcing, you don't have the time. So you might skip and jump ahead, and then therefore you have to come back. That's not like terrible. I mean, we all have to also remember at the end of the day, the general like role of a designer or product designer rather is like, we're just making tools and things for people. We're not like solving like how people enter a hospital necessarily. Like, I think that with a grain of salt, like should be applied to most things. And so while everyone wants to do like, or follow a rubric to a T, it's just not always that necessary. I think at some point you circle back and you look for these things, you look for the gaps, and you try and fill them again. So don't feel too bad if like you've jumped ahead and you need to return. But like that, in terms of best practices too, for like trying to keep that at bay, kind of like Vlad said earlier, like you showcasing any work to any customer in any facet is research. It's very baseline research and it's foundational research, but you can move into like formative and iterative research and all those things just by starting to do the super simple things, just usability. I think people want to nitpick pixel design, but not always really their realm to be doing that. You really want to focus on usability and understanding the concepts and writing and stuff like that. Is like the key for making sure that thing actually works. So when you do prototypes or you're trying to showcase in front of somebody, a couple of different ways to go about that. InVision is great for sharing and gathering feedback, but it's kind of limiting in terms of like micro interaction work and animations and things like that, unless you're using Studio, which not everyone has access to. And so I think to all these small tools, that like I'm a big proponent of like of using Principle, which doesn't really solve for the same exact things. Let's say
an animation tool for those that haven't used.
So Principle is a newer iOS-driven prototyping tool that's been around for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. Ex-Apple developer left and created it. It's extremely powerful, it's extremely versatile, and it's extremely, I don't want to say simple to use, but it's definitely less of a curve than some other ones, let's say Framer or Origami, that are all like maybe node driven, which are much more complicated.
So those are code driven. You have to actually write
Yeah.
JavaScript code for Framer or others. While Principal, it's more of like keyframes, like using something like iMovie.
Yeah, it's a little bit more familiar to, let's say, if you're familiar with like After Effects or Flash from back in the day. So it's a little bit more of a Sketch-like cousin, but it also kind of imports from Sketch. It works really well with Sketch, and it also starts to work really well with Figma. So I think that like in terms of like process or looking for best practices or tools or ways to go about these things, one thing I've just want to drive home always is just, if you can, and if you have the time and you have the resources, just iterate. You know, like don't be afraid to try a couple new things and then put it in front of people. You know, I think with large companies, it can be hard because you have to wait to do those things, or just through that methodology or because of the politics. But if you're in a startup situation and you have the option to kind of drive your own ship, do those things early. Like, you know, don't worry that the pixels are not flawless. Like, you'd be surprised how often the naked eye doesn't recognize those things. And so even if you're trying to be a very detail-oriented designer, that will come. Like, let it happen later on. Like when you do speccing and redlining and stuff like that for like developer handoff, you have to also take it with a great grain of salt. You're not going to always work with developers that understand the exact same things that you understand. You can't, and vice versa. There could be no like expectation within that relationship. So using tools such as like Zeppelin, if you're not familiar with it, is a awesome third-party tool that works in it's server side. So a lot of large companies don't have access to it because it's a security issue. But what it does is it allows you to store all of your Sketch and Figma files in a very organized way that everyone can collaborate with. Now, what's also awesome about it is that it creates libraries. It creates a system that can be handed off to a developer or a team with extreme ease. So no guesswork on pixel level detail, spacing, typography, color usage, stuff like that. You can even have all the assets available in this little platform to pull down with also great ease. So like, and you just iterate and it pulls from your Sketch file. It's all plug-in connected. It's a super seamless and awesome and well-documented platform that I totally recommend looking into. There's other systems that work kind of similarly, like Lingo, but I don't think it's as powerful or as intuitive. So, you know, getting earlier stage designs, doing like having a good product requirement doc helps keep things at bay. It helps keep things organized, and it helps keep things shared. And so everyone's on the same page. And then from there, you know, when you develop like concepts and you explore and you look into like why you're going about this at all, that's kind of when you take the reins. And then you just kind of work in between your PM and your engineering partners to make sure that they're always involved. You don't want to throw them surprises. They know things you don't, and vice versa. So having a good relationship with like those folks is super important. The moment you don't have that, like, change teams. Like, and that might sound like kind of like abrupt, but like it's just not going to be a healthy relationship. You want to have a good relationship with everybody, and you all make a good product. And at the same time, I do want to caveat that like when you do have a good group of people, the level of detail and things that you need to collaborate on become a little less formal, and maybe a little bit easier to go about over time. So I think like, yeah, working with your partners early on, working with possible research early on and mid state is super important, but don't lose like sight of like, you're just trying to create something that other people like. You're not going to get it perfect the first time at all. And even your designs that you think, it's kind of like going back and looking at your hairstyle when you're in high school. You're like, why would I do that? So like you could, but with tech, it's shorter than that. You go back a month later and realize, what was I thinking? So I think that like just kind of moving fast and breaking things in that Facebook mentality is pretty solid. but from the Google mentality where, you know, be cautious and like sort of don't go too far. Otherwise you might have to dial it back. I think are two really good ways to approach these projects and products that you're working on, whether it's large scale or not. Looking at it from like a short-term lens versus a long-term lens is pretty important, because you don't want to go too far and then have to dial it back because you didn't consider a bunch of different things.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, Alex, thank you so much for your time today. I know we ran a bit over there, so I want to make sure we don't keep you any longer. One of the biggest takeaways that I think we can summarize there is design, whether we look at it as a practice or the people doing it or the process behind it, it's fluid and it needs to be adapted to who you are as a founder and potentially as a designer, what your team looks like, who you have access to, who you already know and who you can pull onto your team, and to build a process around them, because there is no exact formula, because the design is an innately human process that has to adapt to the individuals that are actually working behind it. So Alex, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, no worries. You guys feel free to connect or whatever, and if you have questions, let me know. I don't know if you have something scheduled to do this again, but always happy to help out, so let me know.
Awesome. Thank you, Alex.
Yeah, thank you guys. Yeah, and it was really nice to meet you guys. I hope this was helpful / slightly valuable. And then Vlad, just touch base with me later and we'll go from there.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alex.
All right, guys. Talk soon.
Thank you, Alex.
Take care.
Yeah, no problem. Later.
All right. And everyone else, I'll hang on for a few minutes after this, just in case anyone has questions they want to cover. But I want to make sure that we get everyone out of here at a reasonable time as well. So next session will be next Thursday at the same time. It will be dev focused. We will have my co-founder Venkat and 3 developers from Turtle joining us in the second half guest section. And potentially there will be someone co-teaching the first section with me who started a coding bootcamp.